Hello, dear patrons and friends. Welcome to the Lost Art Masterpieces lecture series brought to you by the Asian chapter of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museums, APAVM. My name is Lillian Chin, and I'm a board member of APAVM based in Hong Kong. I'm honored to be your moderator for today's lecture. The Lost Art Masterpieces lecture series is made up of 4 lectures, 3 of which I assume you already have had the opportunity to listen to. In a very short while, we'll be embarking on the last and final lecture of this wonderful series. APAVM is a non-profit organization, and its patron exists to preserve, protect, and restore the arts in the Vatican Museum. To learn more of the events and trips organized by APAVM, I would like to invite Thomas Ng, another board member of APAVM, who's based in Australia, to share his experience on the past events and trips. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Lillian. Hello, everyone. I'm normally based in Melbourne, but today I just arrived in Manila. So greetings from Manila. Now, there have been quite a number of annual APVM trips in the past. This sadly came to a pause with COVID-19, of course. But in this void, APAVM intensified its series of virtual lectures, which have been wonderful. Do not take my word for it. Watch the recordings which have been curated in the APAVM website, which have recently been redeveloped and relaunched. This year, the annual trip resumed in June, and my wife and I were among the fortunate ones to be able to take part in it. I cannot compare with the previous trips because I didn't go on them, but this one was really exceptional for us. We were allowed access to several of the restoration labs to observe all the wonderful work being done. This is not normally open to the public, or not actually open to the public. And we met many of the very interesting and talented people who were doing this work. We were also able to see work in progress for future exhibits. In particular, we were delighted to see the work being done to prepare an exhibit on China. One of the many magical moments was when the Sistine Chapel was closed to the public and we had a choir perform there just for us. And dining inside the Vatican Museum was also something rather special. As you can see, and these are photos when we were in Tuscany, we did have a lot of fun and with really great company. In Siena, we had a private audience with the Archbishop and learned a lot about St. Catherine and the Palio. My wife and I are looking forward to the trip next year, which will start in Malta and end in Rome. We are very privileged to be a member of APAVM, which enables us to sign up for these trips. As patrons, we are treated like VIP everywhere we go and given special access to places which are not open to the public. We saw several signs which said patrons only when we visited the Vatican. We even get a hefty 30% discount for purchases at the Vatican Museum gift shops. Here is how you can register. You can always start by being a friend of APVM first. It is not just about faith or art, but it is also about beauty, food, wine, and comradeship. Thank you. Back to you, Lillian.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, now I'm sure everyone is excited and anxiously waiting to listen to today's lecture, which is titled Napoleon's Art Heist in Rome and the Vatican. Rome has been invaded many times over a history of almost 3,000 years. One of the most devastating incursions was at the end of the 18th century, when French troops stripped the city of the artworks and shipped them to Paris to be displayed in the Louvre Museum. Napoleon kidnapped the Pope, and the Vatican was looted. Historian Paul Wescher described it as the largest movement of works of art in history. For 3 days, a bonfire in the Belvedere courtyard at the Vatican consumed the liturgical vestments and canvases that had been kept in the Apostolic Palace centuries. Our speaker for today is Leonardo Marra. Leonardo has worked for almost a decade at the Vatican with a talented team in charge of institutional events presided over by the Pope. He was a curator at the Papal sacristy and Sistine Chapel, researching historical items and working on Vatican exhibits. Leonardo developed the first modern archival system for his office, where he recorded centuries of oral and written traditions. He later spent 10 years as director of events for a non-profit global organization and has worked with patrons and philanthropists for over 20 years and is now a fundraising events manager in the United States. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Leonardo Marra to present the much-awaited lecture.
Good evening to everyone, and thanks to Mr. Ben Chang and to the Asian patrons of the arts and the Vatican museums. It is a great privilege for me to be sharing this time with you, and I'm connecting from the United States of America, more precisely from Montana, where I work and live now. So as was briefly mentioned, I started working at the Vatican in 1999. And I worked there for nearly 10 years, nearly a decade. I was a member of the Office of the Liturgical Ceremonies of the Holy Father. And in that role, I served during many papal ceremonies and important moments, key moments of history. So my role actually gave me the privilege of being very close, not only to the Holy Father, but also to the Vatican, and that is where I learned and where I started loving everything about my tenure there, the art, the traditions, the history, and everything that I am today goes back to those years when I really experienced what it means to be close to the heart of the church and to one of the most beautiful places in the world. So in that role, I was also involved, heavily involved in the preparation of the conclave for the election of the Pope, because my office was actually accessible through the Sistine Chapel. And these two pictures show the preparation of the Sistine Chapel right before the conclave, resulting in the election of Pope Benedict. So these are the pictures describing my tenure at the Vatican, and where I was part of many important ceremonies. This is another beautiful time that I worked there. You know that each basilica, each one of the four major basilicas, has a so-called holy door, and the holy door is open at the beginning of the Jubilee year and closed at the end of it. And so there are beautiful rituals related to that important moment, and this is portraying one of those. This is the cathedral of St. John of the Lateran in Rome. And this is the Sistine Chapel for the preparation of the conclave. So now let's dive into our time, where we will be talking about many people, Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, and then two of the popes that will be part of this lecture. The first one is Pope Pius VI, portrayed in this picture, and then his successor. And we will also be briefly talking about another person that was crucial in that time of history, which will be Antonio Canova. So the French Revolution was really a turning point in the world history, and it ended in the late 1790s with the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte. And we are at the beginning of the 1790s, and Pope Pius VI openly condemned the revolution, especially, but not only, because Napoleon started confiscating churches' property. And so a sort of a mutual antagonism between the Pope and Napoleon kept growing and growing until a dramatic time in history when Napoleon started the first Italian campaign. And as a part of that campaign, which took place in the late 1796, Napoleon attacked the Pope's territories that were known as the Papal States. And they extended to a considerable portion of the Italian peninsula. And so not long after the invasion started, Pius VI was forced to agree on exchanging land, money, and art for peace. So we're talking about a time when the Pope really didn't fight against Napoleon. the forces were too different, and so there was really no other chance for the Pope than to start signing treaties to defend whatever was there left to defend. So the first agreement was reached in a beautiful city located in northern Italy called Bologna. And when they signed this agreement, Bologna itself, together with Ancona and Ferrara, were given to Napoleon. There were no fights. Again, this was a very last attempt, to save the church and to save whatever was there. And a lot of art pieces were donated, were given to Napoleon as a part of this agreement, as a part of this treaty. And so we're talking about paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, books from the Vatican Library. And this is the very first time when a lot of these treasures left the Vatican. Shortly after, and we are on the 19th of February, 1797, another treaty was signed, the famous Treaty of Tolentino, where the Pope had to reconfirm all the previous agreements and where more money was given to Napoleon. We're talking about millions of scudi, the then currency. And also the city of Avignon was given to Napoleon and many other territories. The 9th of May, 1797, a convoy with hundreds of masterpieces, including two of the most important sculptures that one can see today at the Vatican, left Rome for Paris. Worst had to come yet. Between December 1797 and the beginning of 1798, French troops led by General Berthier invaded, looted, and occupied Rome. And during the invasion of Rome, Napoleon's soldiers destroyed or looted the jewels, the treasuries that had been kept at the Vatican for centuries, including the papal tiaras. So the French collected everything they could. They were mostly looking for gold and silver and sculptures and paintings, but when they found vestments and canvases, they realized that they were too heavy to be transported to Paris. And so they put them all in a big courtyard that is at the Vatican. It is the place where I used to park my car at the Vatican, the Belvedere courtyard. And they started a fire, a bonfire that for days and days and days burned the vestments. 15th of February, 1798, Napoleon abolishes the Papal States and proclaims the Roman Republic. This is one of the lowest points of history because Pius VI was deposed and taken prisoner. And he was taken prisoner to Siena, Florence, Bologna, and then finally in France to Grenoble, and then finally imprisoned in a fortress in a city called Valence in France, where later he died. He died in exile on the 29th of August, 1799. This is very sad. Napoleon wanted an inscription on his grave. Citizen Giannangelo Braschi, in art, Pope. This is very sad, because you can see in that very simple inscription, in that very simple sentence, the hate for the Holy Father. He was just a citizen that used to call himself the Pope. Really, really sad. These are two of the sculptures that I briefly mentioned, and these are two of the sculptures that were part of that convoy that on May 1797 left Rome for Paris. And the first one is the famous Laocoon, which is related to the myth of the Trojan horse. And the other is Apollo of the Belvedere, one of the most, if not the most known sculpture of ancient Roman history. And when one goes to the Vatican today, you can see it displayed in this beautiful courtyard. It is called the Octagonal Court, where people can see the most important sculptures that there are at the Vatican together. So not only classical sculptures like these two, but also sculptures made by Antonio Canova that I briefly mentioned before that we will encounter in a few minutes. Apollo, the one on the right, Apollo has been considered one of the most beautiful expressions of art that are present in history. And some people say that Michelangelo was so impressed when he saw this sculpture that the features of Apollo can be found in some of his paintings, while the other sculpture, Laocoon, is one of the most beautiful pictures and images of pain. So after Pius VI's death in the late 1790s, precisely 1799, Cardinal Chiaramonti was elected to the papacy on the 14th of March, 1800, and he took the name of Pius VII. His election took place in exile in Venice because Rome was still occupied by the French troops, and so the papal seat was vacant for 6 months. But there was a problem. The cardinals had no papal tiara to crown the pope with, given what we just said, and so Pius VII was crowned in Venice with an improvised tiara that you can see on the right-hand side. No jewels, no precious stones, no gems, a very, very simple tiara that is still part of the papal sacristy, the place where I used to work for over 10 years. So during my tenure at the Vatican, I had the possibility of studying this very piece that you see portrayed in the picture. Meanwhile, Napoleon had just returned from Egypt, from a military campaign, and took full power with a coup d'etat. And so between May and June 1800, he started the Second Italian campaign. Pius VII portrayed in the picture, especially thanks to his Secretary of State, Cardinal Consalvi, originally got off to a good start with Napoleon and was able to sign a laborious agreement a few months after his election. It is known as the Concordat of 1801. In reality, Napoleon had just agreed on recognizing that the church was the religion of the great majority of the French people, but simultaneously tried to limit, the size of the French clergy and, to sort of have him do what he wanted to do. And the agreement drastically restricted the Pope's authority in France. So here there is another timeline talking about a few other dates. We talked about the election of the Pope in Venice. We talked about the Second Italian campaign beginning and the Concordat of 1801. Now, this is where we see that Napoleon started getting more power, more and more. And so 1 year later, Napoleon becomes consul for life. And a couple of years later, precisely in 1804, Napoleon establishes the French Empire and invites Pius VII to Paris. On the 2nd of December, 1804, the coronation of Napoleon and Josephine took place. And this is a very interesting point in history. Now, we will briefly talk about the coronation ceremony and propaganda. But I would like to talk with you about what could have been Napoleon's deep motivations. Because really, what was Napoleon? Was he an eager collector? Was he a thief? Did he want to humiliate the nations that he conquered? Or did he have something in mind, a plan, a vision, as people say today? Well, nobody in history before and after Napoleon showed such determination in acquiring treasures. So he proclaimed to be carrying freedom to people, but in the end, him and his troops looted everything they found on their path. And we're talking about sculptures, paintings, books, manuscripts. Napoleon understood the value of controlling his image and using the arts to instill respect and admiration for himself and his policies. So he basically wanted to turn Paris into a world center in where to gather treasures from all over Europe first and then the world later. So Paris was supposed to be, the capital of this new civilization whose intent, and listen to this, was to restore the glory of ancient Rome. So Napoleon believed in the power of the arts as a propaganda tool to glorify his reign and the new empire that he had established. And he used the arts to promote the view that France was carrying on the traditions of the Roman Republic and the Holy Roman Empire. He also would refer to himself as the new Julius Caesar or Charlemagne. As you can see, there are two pictures. One is a medal where you see Napoleon looking like a Roman emperor, and the other is a bust made by Antonio Canova. He was an incredibly talented Italian sculptor who dedicated his career to reviving the classical style of art. So when today people go to the Vatican, to the Octagonal Court that I briefly mentioned, they can see Laocoon and Apollo di Belvedere, and next to them, masterpieces made by Antonio Canova. Let's go back to the coronation ceremony. So one purpose of Napoleon's move was to sort of legitimize his government. And so he wanted to elevate himself to the same level as other European sovereigns. And the title of emperor reflected also his esteem for the Roman Republic, as well as France's growth in size. There were extravagant decorative elements throughout the entire city of Paris and imposing architectural elements in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which is where the coronation ceremony took place. And to make this moment as impressive as possible, Napoleon recruited exceptional designers and artists, including Jacques-Louis David. We will talk about David in a second. I will show you one of the most famous paintings of this great artist. Imagine that the coronation ceremony was planned as carefully as a military campaign. It was attended by huge crowds and over 8,000 dignitaries. Pius VII had agreed to go to Paris, right? He wasn't forced to go. And we understand, we believe that he did it in view of maintaining a good relationship. He had assumed that after the agreement of 1801 and after becoming emperor, Napoleon would further reward the church, but we will see that this will not happen. Now, for the coronation, Napoleon wore a purple velvet cloak, and his crown was made, as you can see in the pictures, was made of gold laurel leaves, intended to recall the glory of ancient Rome. Napoleon was very conscious of symbolism and iconography throughout his entire life. The coronation ceremony lasted 3 hours, and the imperial couple sat on thrones that had been placed in a prominent place on a platform in Notre Dame's cathedral. Now, many of the objects used in the coronation displayed Napoleon's personal emblem, the bee. Whoever is familiar with the Vatican has seen the bee everywhere because it was part of the crest of the famous Barberini family that also was honored having a pope, actually more than once, and cardinals from this important family. And so the bee, actually, that you see in the first picture, provided continuity also with the King of France, Charlemagne. He used to be he was the Holy Roman Emperor. And so he had used the bee as his personal emblem 1,000 years before Napoleon. But also ancient Egyptians, ancient Romans, and Christians, they were all associated with the bee in some ways, with the bee and the hive, that resemble regeneration, wisdom, industry, and obedience. Napoleon's coat of arms that we can see on the other side of the picture is characterized by the Imperial Eagle, another ancient Roman symbol, another ancient Roman element, surrounded by the collier of the Légion d'honneur, which is the Legion of Honor in English that he instituted in 1802. It's an order, a very prestigious order still existing. And so the eagle became the symbol of the French Empire, and it was part of, this branding of the new empire, and again, resembling Imperial Rome. The staff that you see on the left of the coat of arms of Napoleon portrays the hand of justice, giving a benediction, while the scepter on the right portrays Charlemagne. Other decorative elements and symbols of the French Empire were the lion and the elephant and the rooster. This is, again, the Imperial Eagle. And if you look at some sculptures, for example, from ancient Rome, you will see that this was part of the Roman legions, and it looks exactly the same. The sketch you see on the left was part of the decorations for the coronation ceremony. And this is the picture that I briefly mentioned before, made by David, where one can see the coronation of Napoleon, who's standing in a center holding his crown, and Josephine is holding Josephine's crown. She's kneeling in front of him, and the Pope is seated behind the couple. Now, here it is rather difficult to understand what is a legend, what is historical, but according to a legend, Napoleon, wanting to show who was really in charge, grabbed the crown from the surprised Pope and placed it on his head himself. Other people believe that Pope Pius VII handed Napoleon the crown that he placed on his own head before crowning Josephine. And this painting, a coronation of Napoleon, is probably the best known depiction of this moment. But what happened is that in England, for example, British humorists lost no time making fun of the diminished status of the Pope. Whether strictly true or not, the relationship between Napoleon and Pius VII deteriorated from that point forward. You can see in a detail the Pope sitting on his throne, and in the close-up, one can see the Pope's tiara in the back. So the first comment that we can express is that Napoleon shows power. He is wearing a crown. The Pope is not. And so again, this moment was probably the perfect stage for Napoleon to humiliate the Pope and show who was really in control, who was really in charge. Pius VII had tried whatever he could, to keep peace, but unfortunately, this did not save him. Let's look at another timeline. 10th of June, 1809, Napoleon invades again the Papal States and makes them part of his empire. And so Pius VII had no alternative but excommunicating Napoleon. But a little bit after that, Napoleon kidnapped the Pope. The Pope was, at the time, staying at a palace, a very beautiful palace in Rome called Quirinale, which is the place where the president of the Italian Republic lives and works today. But it was part of the church's properties, and so that is where the Pope was living at the time. So French troops entered the Quirinale Palace and defeated the Swiss guards. I know that most of you guys are familiar with the Swiss guards. They're still guarding the Pope's palace today, following this old tradition, this noble tradition. And so Pius VII was abducted. And again, as it had happened before with Pius VI, even his successor, Pius VII, was kidnapped by Napoleon. And he was taken to Savona, which is a city near Genoa in northwest of Italy. And he did not return to Rome for another 5 years. On the 2nd of February, 1810, Vatican archives were robbed. And so hundreds of books, maps, documents, manuscripts left Rome again for Paris in a convoy. So this happened not only once or twice, it happened multiple times. And Napoleon's goal was again to bring everything to Paris and to put the art pieces in the museum, in the Louvre Museum, and the books and manuscripts, either in private collections or in public collections. Pius VII was forced in January 1813 to sign a new treaty, the Concordat of Fontainebleau, where he gave up his sovereignty. This is probably the lowest point in the relationship between the church and Napoleon. But there was, fortunately, thank goodness, this lasted only a few months because Napoleon was forced to abdicate, and Pius VII allowed to return to Rome as a hero. He was celebrated as a defender of the faith. He struggled. And just a little digression, when I was working at the Vatican, I had the possibility of working and studying this tiny wooden crucifix. That is what Pius VII brought with him throughout those terrible years when he was forced to leave Rome, and so that kept him close to our Lord Jesus Christ, and it is today displayed in the private collections of the Papal sacristy as one of the most precious treasures. It's really nothing but a very small crucifix made of wood, but it has an enormous importance for what it represents. And Canova, remember Canova, we spoke about him before. Well, at this time, Antonio Canova was director of the Vatican Museums, and so Cardinal Consalvi named him as a pontifical delegate and sent him to Paris to create an inventory of the stolen art and bring it back to Rome. This is how we know what Napoleon took from Rome and from the Vatican, just because of what Canova did. Unfortunately, the process took several years, and so many difficulties occurred, and many objects never returned. Meanwhile, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, but it was actually not an imprisonment because Napoleon was able to keep his title of emperor. He was given full sovereignty over the island. And in fact, a few months later, he disembarked on the French coast with 1,000 men and began marching to Paris. So Napoleon had a sort of a second wind, and he raised a new grand army that enjoyed a temporary success. And then finally, he had a crushing defeat at Waterloo against an allied force led by General Wellington. And so, and then finally, this is the end of Napoleon. But this is an object that I wanted to talk about with you, because this is the object that relates Napoleon and Pius VII like no one else, like nothing else. At his coronation, Napoleon had actually promised to send the Pope an altar, 2 ornate ceremonial coaches, and a tiara. But only the tiara was delivered. And it is exactly the one that you see in the picture. This is part of the collections of the papal treasury. Now, while very well decorated, with jewels, it was way too small and heavy to be worn. And it meant to be an insult to the Pope. Imagine that traditionally tiaras weighed between 2 and 5 pounds. This weighed 18 pounds, and it was actually way too small to fit comfortably on a human head. So I had the possibility of studying this object, and when you lift it, you see that there is wood inside, and that the hole, which is supposed to fit on a person's head, is way too small, super small. So some of the jewels and decorations for this tiara came from earlier tiaras that had been stolen by the French troops in 1798 when General Bordier invaded Rome. And in particular, the tiara carried at its top a huge emerald that had apparently been removed by the tiara of Pius VII's predecessor. You might remember we briefly mentioned the Treaty of Tolentino, in where Pope Pius VI was forced to give away a lot of treasures and money and art. And apparently that huge emerald that you see on this tiara was part of the treaty. This emerald was believed to be originally part of a tiara worn by Pope Gregory XIII, Pope Boncompagni. So we're talking about the end of the 16th century. And but during my time at the Vatican, I was personally able to discover and then confirm that the same enormous emerald used to ornate the tiara of Julius II, the Pope of Michelangelo, and of the Sistine Chapel, who lived nearly 3 centuries before Napoleon. So you see what I said when I said that the tiara was sort of a joke, because really it was made with jewels that had been stolen by the papal sacristy. Is what it was too heavy to be worn, and the tiara was given to Napoleon, to Pope Pius VII as an homage from Napoleon in the attempt of making peace, but really in the end it was just another way to humiliate the Pope. So the tiara was received at the Vatican in June 1805, so a few months after Pope Pius VII presided at the coronation of Napoleon. And so this is why the one depicted in the picture by David that we briefly saw before cannot be the same tiara. So for a long while, people referred to this as the tiara that Napoleon sent to Pius VII to invite him to Paris for his coronation, but actually this happened later. So even if the tiara was a sort of an insult to the Pope, he still thanked Napoleon by letter, and we have this letter. The letter is dated June 23rd, 1805, and the Pope said that he intended to use the tiara for the feast of St. Peter and Paul, but we know that this never happened for the reasons that we just discussed. The tiara, you see, has a central structure of white velvet with crowns of gold, ornated with flowers and leaves. And then there were rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, brilliants, and pearls. It is believed that the tiara would cost way over $3 million of today's currency. There were some bas-reliefs glorifying Napoleon. I said there were bas-reliefs and there were precious jewels because the tiara was actually modified. So the decorations, specifically referring to Napoleon, were removed by Cardinal Consalvi. Then I also read something very interesting that during the insurrection of 1831, this tiara was actually buried in the Vatican gardens. It was put in 2 boxes, one inside another, and buried in the Vatican gardens and suffered great damage. So it needed to be restored and partially resized later. So with the exception of the emerald that you see at the top, and that, as we discussed, was part of Julius II's tiara, Pope Benedict XV had the tiara's jewels removed and replaced by replicas made of glass. So what you see today when looking at a tiara are just pieces of glass, besides the huge emerald at the top. The jewels were sold actually to raise money for the victims of First World War. So again, this object gives us the possibility of talking about those terrible years when Napoleon had no mercy, when Napoleon wanted to portray himself as the new Julius Caesar, as the new Charlemagne, where he thought about taking everything he could from the Vatican, and whatever he couldn't take to Paris, he destroyed, he burned. And it was interesting to study this time and to study these objects, which have so much to say. This is a picture. There are two pictures showing my tenure at the Vatican, and I would like to share a few words on the papal sacristy and on the treasury, where I spent over 10 years conducting historical research and compiling records for the creation of a new modern archival system. It was briefly mentioned that one of my duties there at the Vatican was to record centuries of oral traditions, and so my job was to take these objects and analyze them, mostly before exhibitions, but not exclusively. And so I had the possibility of working every day with chalices, with monstrances, and pyxes, and all the liturgical objects and liturgical vestments and reliquaries that are kept there. When I left my position, almost 10 years after I got that job, I remember there were 194 chalices. I'm only talking about the chalices, and but the peculiar thing about that is that most of them are from after Napoleon, and it is clear, right? Because he took everything. So even if the papal sacristy is a place with incredible objects, beautiful masterpieces made in the past and donated, to the popes throughout history, most of them were stolen by Napoleon. And so there are, for example, 3 chalices from the Middle Ages, but they are there just because they were given to the church after Napoleon's robberies. Otherwise, if they had been there, they would have been stolen. So some of the things had been hidden in the palaces. For example, there is this beautiful image of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's an icon called the Mandilion of Edessa, which was hidden. But again, most of the treasures were taken during those terrible years. And the sacristy is accessible through a door that is actually inside of the Sistine Chapel. So when looking at Michelangelo's Last Judgment, that blue wall, that you guys have seen many times, and never enough times, you look at the Last Judgment, and on the left there is a tiny door that you can see me opening. You can see my hand opening it, and that gives access to the papal sacristy. So the sacristy is really for the care of all holy items and relics and liturgical vestments. And so these objects and pieces of garments, they don't belong to a proper museum, but to a place that continues to live on. And so among these hundreds of items, there are objects that are consecrated to history, while others are still in use for the papal ceremonies. And so, they're used, most of these objects are used in St. Peter's Basilica or in the chapels of the Apostolic Palace, including the Sistine Chapel, the Pauline Chapel, and the Redemptoris Mater Chapel. Or they're used in the parishes of Rome or during the Pope's visits abroad. So some of these objects that are kept in there relate to key moments in the history of the Catholic Church and of the world, while others are to be considered the relics, as they belonged and were used by popes that later became saints. And there are some mitres like the one in the picture, or some chasubles. This picture shows in the back one of the copes, piviale, as we say in Italian, that the popes used to wear in the past. Some of them are incredibly heavy. And so if a person had to wear them today, you would see that they're not only heavy, but enormous, very, very long, because they would surround not only the Pope's body, but also the throne that he was sitting on. And then you see there are some tiaras like the one in the picture, that is the tiara of Pius IX, also worn by John the 23rd in more recent times, in the 20th century. So this time, together talking about Napoleon and talking about Pius VII mostly, but also his predecessor, Pius VI, and Antonio Canova, which was the element, connecting all these figures, really gives us time to reflect on how important it is to preserve art today. And the Vatican does an incredible job in this, because art is there for people to be shared, and art is there for people to be enjoyed. I believe that it was a privilege. I felt I was privileged in having the possibility of working at the Vatican for so many years, of meeting interesting people that dedicate their life to the preservation of the art. And I know that thanks to people like you, thanks to generous donors and supporters, patrons of the Vatican, it is possible to preserve all of this and keep it for the future. You know that sometimes we face the terrible moments in history, and unfortunately, we cannot talk about wars as something that belongs only to the past. But you know, it is our responsibility to preserve whatever has been kept for centuries. And so, on my part, I wanted to thank you for what you do for the Vatican, because if I was able to spend, you know, so many years looking and working with these treasures, it is because of people like you that spend their own money and time and energy and dedication and passion to preserve art and history.
Thank you, Leonardo, for an interesting and insightful lecture. So if you're okay, we'll now start with the Q&A session. Patrons and friends, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so we now start with the first question, Leonardo.
Yes.
This is from Bruce Hemmingson. I understand that much of the art from Napoleon's spoliation efforts ended up at the Louvre in Paris. Do we have any idea how much of this art has never been repatriated to Italy and the other countries of Europe?
Well, actually, the answer to this will answer also the following question, because really, I've always heard this question, you know, in my life, and say, why haven't the objects been returned? But we have to consider that part of the agreements were actually just temporary agreements. And so I briefly mentioned that Canova, as a pontifical delegate, was sent to Paris to make an inventory, and he was able to identify and retrieve some of the objects, but not all of them. So what we know is what was taken from Rome, because there were records of what the Vatican had, you know, and what Napoleon took, but a lot of the objects were never found by Canova, while others were kept in France in private collections. And so it is impossible. And also, if you go back to history, you see what ancient Romans did. Rome has 25 obelisks in the city of Rome. There are more obelisks in Rome than in Cairo, in Egypt. And so this whole business of, you know, restitution really has never worked. It would require too complex international agreements, and you would start getting into a loop where there is really no end, no beginning and no end. There is an obelisk, for example, that had been taken by Mussolini in the 1920s from Northern Africa. It used to be displayed in Rome, not far from Circus Maximus. And there was this whole, you know, business and this whole craziness of the restitution of this obelisk. And you can't imagine the legal problems and international, you know, embarrassment and diplomatic embarrassment that was behind that. So I guess it is just something that everybody accepts. Many civilizations were spoliated, and it would be impossible to restart, you know, to start giving back pieces. And so every once in a while, for example, when a stolen object is found in a private collection, that can be sent back. But when we talk about, you know, history, it's impossible. Then also after Napoleon lost the war, he was forced to give back what he had stolen. But again, it was nearly impossible to do that. And so some of the objects, for example, that Napoleon stole in Italy are now in England because the British took them and kept them, and now they're displayed in their museums. It's just how history really, how it ended up. I mean, it's unfortunate, but we cannot go back to those times and present a list of objects that are now displayed in the Louvre and say we want them back. It would never work. It would never work. And the parties that would be actually legally, in charge of signing such an agreement wouldn't exist, because there's no Napoleon today. And so, okay, we have the Catholic Church and its highest representative, but on the other hand, it would be impossible. So, unfortunately, it is one of the many dark times in history when this happened, and there's no way to have those treasures back.
Understood. Thank you. Question number 2 is actually from William Chang. It's kind of like related to the first question, but a little bit different.
Right.
One of the most famous pieces stolen was Verone's Wedding at Cana, now at Louvre. So why hasn't it been returned to the Vatican? Indeed, has the Vatican made attempts to recover these priceless treasures of art, and how many % has been recovered?
Again, as briefly mentioned, no attempts today can be made, and whatever returned to the Vatican is part of what Canova was able to retrieve. But we are talking about a small percentage. I would say we're close to 80% of what was taken. And so, unfortunately, there is no way. And some of those objects, nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows. Maybe they are in some private homes. Maybe they are in other countries. Maybe they have been sold. Gold has been melted and reused. Jewels have been recycled in different ways. So there's really no way to have any of that back today.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
The third question is from Father Michael Collins. Is there a good fire protection system in the papal sacristy?
This would require a diplomatic answer. But I would say yes. And it is a place that is close to the public, as Father Michael knows very well. And so, but of course, more could be done for the preservation of those objects. And but it is very expensive to keep everything in climate control, for example, which would be ideal. Or when we talk about the textiles, that canvases and vestments that should actually lay horizontally and not vertically. So those are all big projects for the future, for the preservation of what is in the papal sacristy. A lot more could be done. A lot has been done. So, for example, all the pieces of furniture where these beautiful objects are were restored during my tenure at the Vatican. And so that, makes it possible for objects to be displayed in safe cabinets, beautiful wooden cabinets and safe cases. But again, it's a very expensive and long process, which hopefully will never end, because we will always be looking for people wanting to do more for the preservation of those unique and incredible pieces of art that are there.
Great answer. Okay, the next question is again from William Chang. In your time working at the Vatican, what was the most significant personal encounter you've had with one or more of the popes?
I've actually been so privileged. I don't know how to describe those moments that are really deep in my heart. I remember I had special moments with John Paul II, and I served him until the end of his life, and I was able to portray his generosity. Sometimes he would get to the sacristy, which is in St. Peter's Basilica by the Pietà. That is where the Pope gets dressed before Mass. He would get there suffering, really, really sick. For him, he was in a wheelchair. He was shaking. He was really feeling sick. And then he would still collect his thoughts and pray and gives us his blessing, and then go and celebrate Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, a long Mass that would last sometimes up to 2 hours. And then he would return to the little room by the Pietà and get undressed, take off his chasuble, and still have time for people that wanted to take a picture with him. He knew that was probably the only time that these people would have ever had in their life to be that close to the Pope. And so my personal encounters with him happened actually right by the Pietà. And I remember one time the Pope showed up before the Mass, as always, not only to wear the chasuble, but to practice the hymns and to be, reviewing some parts of the Holy Mass with my then boss, His Excellency Monsignor Marini, the Master of Papal Ceremonies. And I remember that John Paul II exchanged a few words with me and even caressed my face. And I will never forget that. It's just something very deep in my heart. I will never forget that. And another time in the Basilica of St. Mary, the Mayor, it was the 1st of January of the year 2000. I had a brief and very intense conversation with John Paul II about the Virgin Mary, actually. And that is another of the treasures that I keep in my heart.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, we have one question from our chairman, Ben Chang. Why hasn't the great collection at the Papal Sacristy ever been exhibited? Wouldn't it be great if APAVM can have a private viewing of the Papal Sacristy during 2023 trip? This will surely get us more signups from patrons and friends listening in.
Well, parts of the collections have been shown in exhibitions. So, for example, I worked on a very big exhibition that was brought to the United States in 2003, and actually 265 pieces left the Papal Sacristy for the United States for 4 cities. We started with Houston, Texas, and then Fort Lauderdale in Florida, and then we went to Chicago, Illinois, and last was San Diego in California. It was a traveling exhibition that lasted over 2 years. So sometimes those objects are loaned on exhibitions. So that is a possibility. And then in terms of visiting the Papal Sacristy, that is a possibility indeed. I mean, of course, through the Master of Ceremonies, which is the custodian of those collections, I think it's a possibility to explore for sure. But exhibitions have been organized, with some of those objects, like the tiaras, for example. So that is definitely something that is not impossible, but it has to be preserved outside of the general public and outside of the, Vatican museums for obvious reasons, not only for security, but also for other reasons. But, it's always there. And then people go and study some of the treasures that are in the Papal Sacristy. So it is not a super inaccessible place, so to speak.
Great. We definitely look forward to seeing those exhibits when we go there next year. I think that's about all the questions that we have for today. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for addressing the questions raised by our patrons and friends.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a privilege to spending time with you. And again, thank you for your magnificent work and for your support to the Vatican. The Vatican couldn't afford, the restoration and preservation of all those pieces if it wasn't for people like you, generous like you. And so I encourage you to do all you can. Could be time, could be money, could be prayers, could be all of that together, for the preservation of that unique and wonderful place. And thank you for this opportunity of sharing this time with you.
Thank you. Okay, we have now come to the end of our lecture series on the Lost Art Masterpieces. Once again, we'd like to thank Leonardo for a wonderful lecture today. But before we end today's session, please stay on a little longer to listen to our upcoming events. Thomas has shared with you some of his experiences in similar yet different trips in the past. And believe me, they are amazing. In April 2023, APAVM will be organizing another trip to Malta, Rome, and the Vatican. You'll be able to witness for yourself the preservation work done at the Vatican Museum. Do not miss the opportunity. Please register on APAVM's website. Last year, despite the many restrictions due to COVID, we still managed to organize a wine pairing dinner for patrons and friends. We had a lot of fun. This year, we'll bring you another amazing event, a whiskey pairing dinner hosted together with Archibald John Gracie. There will also be a pre-dinner lecture on Christianity, Scotland, and the origin of whiskey, presented by Robert Ross Allen. Do register before all the seats are taken. As APAVM is a non-profit organization, your membership as a patron will greatly help to contribute towards the meaningful preservation and restoration work at the Vatican museums. Do consider joining APAVM as a patron at only $750 per annum, or as a friend of APAVM at a small fee of $100 per annum. More details can be found on our website. Once again, on behalf of the Asian chapter of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican, I would like to thank the speakers of our 4 lectures, Father Michael Collins, Linda Melvin, Marla Cristina White da Cruz, and of course, Leonardo Marra. And to the 3 moderators before me today, Charlotte Young, Thomas Ng, and Bruce Hamilton. APAVM wish to also thank Ganesh team, who handle all the technical aspects of this lecture series. Lulu Cheng and Irene Kwong, the 2 chapter administrators based in Singapore and Hong Kong, respectively. But most of all, we wish to thank all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you in our upcoming events. Goodbye, and thank you very much.